Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, people of all races, colors, and creeds. Yes, we all fall into one of those categories, don't we? And you're listening to the greatest show on earth. I'm Greg Anthony on the Investigative Journal, and we're the greatest show on earth because we believe there's only two sexes, men and women. You can't say that anymore unless you're called a racist. That's what they call you, but you can say it here on this show. And you know, I had to do a show like this today. I really did, because I was hearing Trump talking at his congratulatory speech after he was acquitted of being impeached, and he was telling us about all these liars and leakers. Everybody's lying. The Democrats are lying. The fake news is lying. And it made me think, what is the biggest lie ever told? And how many lies have I believed in my life until I realized they weren't true, or possibly the facts showed me that there was probable cause that they weren't true, which led people to believe that I was a conspiracy theorist because I said these things. Things, maxims, things that we hear that we're supposed to believe. Why? Because other people tell us. Yeah, most people tell us everything and we believe it, right? Oh, yeah, man, I can go look up some fancy quotes from some psychologists, from some astrophysicists, and all these people who tell us things. But it really boils down to this. We believe anything we hear once it's told from a big body of people like NASA or other things like our government or like the priests up on the altar. Once they tell us, we believe it. But how many times have we been lied to in our life? And what's the biggest lie that you were ever told? And what's the biggest lie you're still believing? And you know, you get in trouble when you do a show like this because you're going to be called a conspiracy theorist by the very people who are believing in conspiracies. If they believe, if these left-wing and right-wing journalists, and if the government believes what they talk about, then they're the conspiracy theorists because most of it's all lies. But why do 90% of the people believe it? Because they were told to. Yes, they were told to. There's so many different things. For example, I once believed that the Democrat and Republican Party were on the level. They each were, one was conservative, one was liberal. Then I realized, well, they're more like the same. But then I realized they work together at the top, and there's a whole big agenda behind that. Then I once believed that the Vatican was a great organization. Oh, it was such a beautiful organization. Then I found out the truth when I lived in Italy and found out that they were a bunch of scumbags. And basically, they control American and foreign domestic policy as well as are the leaders in the Illuminati and the controllers of the world. Oh, boy. People are going to say he is a conspiracy theorist. Well, you know, I wear that one like a badge of honor because I'm telling you something. When you start looking into this, you can find facts that will show without a doubt that they are what I say they are, a bunch of scoundrels. Still allowed to do all of these political intrigues as they did for hundreds of years. Then once, you know, what else did I believe? Well, I believed that we went to the moon. That's what I was told when I was a kid, as I looked at that big, huge globe on the teacher's desk. And I believed we went to the moon. But then as I started to look at some facts, started to talk to some people, and then dig into it a little deeper, I thought, man, there's no way we could have gone to the moon. And if we did, there's just an outside chance. I would say 95 to 99.9% we never went. So that was shattered. But then it went even farther farther and farther to the point where I don't believe anything that comes out of their mouth, including, guess what? President Trump put started a new military branch. Now we have the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Marines, etc., etc., Air Force. Am I leaving any out? Oh, yes. He initiated the Space Force. And when I heard that, first I started to say, oh, that's cool. It's kind of like Star Wars, right? Oh, it's a Hollywood thing. And then I started thinking, what if there is no space? And what if you start really thinking about it, what if the Earth wasn't the way they told you it was? And baby, there isn't such a thing as space. And I said, well, how could he get money to do that if there is no space? They must be lying. Or can they prove it? How can they prove there's space? Well, then you have to go to NASA. Now, NASA is relatively new. And if you look at NASA, I've talked about it many times. They show you computer images and what looks like artist renditions of everything in space. Can you believe that I'm not even going to get into many of the statistics and many of the things that lead me to believe that I don't know if we can be orbiting or traveling at such speeds. I don't even know if gravity exists anymore because all I've believed it was what they told me. And how many of us can say that's the only way that we can form our belief systems, right? Right. Our belief system is formed from the time we grow up till present day by what they tell us without really giving us proof. And so I started thinking, another reason I'm doing this show, and I know I'm going to get into trouble because somebody's going to say, well, you talk about some serious things, and I can buy that. I can buy some of the facts you give about the Vatican, about the Illuminati, about the New World Order, what we, things that are tangible, actual facts. But really, what about this one? And let's start here because this whole idea of whether what you live on is what they tell you it is really suspect, I think. And we really have to look a little deeper, and I don't think it's crazy. Now, what made me think this was the other day I was listening, and there's a guy who has a company. He's very rich. His name is Elon Musk. I think he runs Tesla, right? Isn't that interesting? Tesla didn't really think much of Einstein. But here's the deal. He said this. He's the one that owns SpaceX. He wants to put people into outer space and make it kind of like flying to the Caribbean for the weekend. Then I said, well, if space isn't there, how can he do that? Well, he must be involved with the people at NASA because they tell us the same thing. And where's the proof outside of all these? Check it out, all these computer images and all these different things that don't look real. And I'm not even going to get in to some of the more nitty-gritty statistics about how they're telling us this is the way we live on what we live in and how they have a difficulty in really proving it. Really. So then I'm listening to a report about Elon Musk, and he wants to create a worldwide internet system for everybody, right? And he wants to put 46,000 satellites into space. So I said, well, wait a minute. If there's no space, how can there be satellites? And so then I started thinking, okay, I'm going to check Google, and I'm going to see if there's what these satellites look like. And they really look phony. I can't believe some of the pictures that they give us. I think Hollywood gives us better pictures. Then I started saying, they always say they send these satellites up, but I never see them on the ground. They should show some pictures of what they look like on the ground. How do they get them up there? And how do they say there's 23,000 or 2,300 satellites, I think they say. I'm not quite sure on that. But he wants to put in 46,000. But I said, if there's no space, how can he do that? And maybe there's no satellites. So I started looking, and I said, pictures and all the things they show me about satellites looks kind of phony. And then I started thinking, how come they never fall down and we don't see any of the debris in the earth? And then they'll probably say something about it all evaporates or something. But to me, the whole idea of satellites is suspect. So I started thinking, well, let me go find some information. So I found some information on the origins of satellites. And so let's talk about that. Let's try to look at it from a different point of view, because you and me are the same. We get our information from people and we believe it, right? People that we're supposed to trust. But who can you trust, really? When you think about it, I don't trust those people in government. I don't trust NASA. Do you? Well, it has to be. I mean, when I went to school, you're thinking there was a globe on the earth, and it was those archaic old people who started thinking about the earth was flat. But look at I checked out a map, the New Standard Map of 1892, and it's really an interesting map because it's a flat earth map. And it really was made by people that went around the earth, whether it be a flat earth going all the way around its circumference, right? And they mapped out areas all around that ice wall that went all the way around. And they still use that today when they navigate airplane flights all over the globe. And you don't believe me? Start checking into that. Because if some of these flights, that they make absolutely no sense if the earth was round. So I said, let's stick to the point. Mr. Musk wants to put up 46,000 satellites and have an internet system worldwide. So, what are the origins of these? Now, whether you believe in them or not, let's look at it. The origins came from the mind of a famous science fiction writer named Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote the 1945 proposal. Before the 50s, you didn't hear about satellites, did you? For NASA. The 1945 proposal by Arthur C. Clarke for geostationary satellite communications. Arthur Clarke was a high-level Freemason, as well as a self-professed pedophile. Throw in Satanism and you've got a heck of a guy there, right? Arthur Clarke was writing science fiction stories along with other notable sci-fi writers like Philip K. Dick, Robert Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. Remember L. Ron in Scientology? Clarke did initially claim to know Hubbard. However, later he denied that statement and thought L. Ron Hubbard to be completely crazy. Well, people are going to say we're crazy for even questioning whether satellites exist. That link to Hubbard had to be broken. All out of rebuke works well. Now, there's a 7-year overlap between 45 to 1952 when Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and Arthur C. Clarke were all alive and were witness to the science fiction industry exploding into the eager minds of young people. And I'm taking this from a writer who's anonymous. And I know why he's anonymous, because he doesn't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist. But he's got some good information. Now, he found that the Roswell crash, so we got this science fiction industry exploding. And the Roswell crash in July 1947, quite timely, and it certainly propelled the interest in space mania, right? Hollywood didn't miss the cue since they owned by the Khazarian Rothschild. Hollywood started cranking out science fiction movies by the truckload. At the top of the sci-fi movie heap was the great undiscovered frontier, space. So it's a science fiction idea, right? All right, but we're going to believe it. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We have to believe it because that's what your teacher told you, right? So, there's an opportunity here to make a ton of money. And boy, let me tell you, NASA has done that. They've made a ton of money off this idea, haven't they? A ton. And at some point, a scheme was hatched to fake launch satellites, perhaps, into space for profit. Wow. NASA has become a tool to constantly remind humans of our insignificant, or very insignificance, in the boundless cosmic order. You know, NASA, they say, has been beating the divinity out of us with pseudoscience, propaganda, and all this spiritual delineation, haven't they? In other words, control. Pre-NASA had accumulated and assimilated the intellectual property from Jack Parsons to the point where he was no longer needed or wanted. Sputnik 1. That's when you started here. Maybe many of you weren't around, but NASA is relatively new. And all of a sudden you hear Sputnik 1 was launched first in 1957. Shocking. Fooling the world. And Explorer 1 soon followed in 1958, the year NASA was created. Wow. So they weren't even around. If you were born before 1958, you're older than NASA. So if you were born like in the 30s and 40s, I don't think you even knew that there were, satellites are relatively new, right? Well, do they really exist? If they are, how come you can't find pictures that make any sense? Computer renditions, that's all you find, artist renditions. It's crazy, but it's true. Now, NASA could be also created to materialize space and the atmosphere below it. But why? Simple. In order to conceal the deceptions. And they need to secure the perimeter and the outer above any jurisdiction. That's what they say. But is there really any satellites? That's the question. I don't know. But I'm telling you, there should be more information on this. Now, this seems a little unrelated, but I don't think so. And I like to talk about this because if Russia, China, and everybody agrees that there are satellites and there's space, and it really doesn't, then don't they work together? And that doesn't exist. Don't they work together? How can we train all of our astronauts in Russia? When you start seeing the Russian facility there, that's kind of interesting. We hate Russia, right? We're always hearing Russia, Russia, Russia. Oh, we can't allow secrets to Russia. But how come we agree about the Antarctic Treaty? And it seems unrelated, but it's not. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, and it is now totally off limits, backed by a military force of 60 to 70 countries. Our enemies agree with us. We don't want to let people in there. And there must be a reason why. Why can't we go there? Because maybe it isn't what they tell us it is. The North Pole is also militarized. Though no formal multilateral agreement exists like in Antarctica, still any attempt to traverse either will result in immediate military expulsion, and possible jail time. So, we look at this and we say, where are all these satellites? To date, also, no human has ever traversed Antarctica, ever. Think about that for a moment and consider the absurdity of it. There's still a continent that has never been explored, and we're not allowed to access it. Why? Because I tell you, there's a possibility it isn't the way they tell us. It isn't on the bottom of the earth. Perhaps it's all around us. Very interesting. And that's what the great explorers who traveled around that ice wall told us and mapped. But they were just, stupid people. Man, you try to take a boat, a ship, wouldn't do what they did without any GPS land base. How come everything's GPS if they're satellites? It's all land-based. So we got a continent that's never explored, but everybody believes what they hear. They believe they got like a barber pole, and people go there and say, this is the South Pole. I mean, come on, it's like believing in Santa Claus. But anyway, if you look at this, NASA can somehow, send a satellite 250, this is what they tell us, 57 million miles away without a hitch. But the deepest hole ever drilled in our Earth is only 7.5 miles. Out of maybe, what do they say, 4,000 miles? The other 3,952 miles is unknown. And pseudoscience fills in the blanks with no true hypothesis, just a lot of nonsense. Man hasn't even been to the bottom of our own ocean. So if we haven't mastered our own domain, how probable is it that NASA could send a probe 257 million miles and retrieve such stunning images? I think the probability is probably zero. And the only real images that exist reside where they were created, on the hard drives of all these NASA computers. And we can talk about Antarctica another time. I've done some shows on that. But there was a lot of ways that they thought, I think, that they could steal a lot of money from people. And NASA is symbolic of this. Now, once you start looking into this, it appears that everything there is a fraud, wouldn't it? All of these moon landings, all of the space talk that we've heard, going to the moon. Why haven't we been back to the moon if we really went? The reason is we never went. Now, secondly, when you say that, you're not going to get on Fox News. You're not going to get on CNN because they all agree in this stuff. Isn't that crazy? They hate each other, but they agree that 9/11 was not an inside job. They never discuss the Vatican. They all agree that it's just a bunch of priests, and we're all racist if we talk about them or hate Catholics. They all agree on those things. They agree that the earth is round. They agree that satellites exist. NASA is a great institution. They all agree on these things, which leads me to believe that they're not true. Now, whether it is round or flat, or whether satellites exist or not, I think we ought to be smart enough to have all the information, and the information that NASA gives us. I mean, it reminds me of watching a Hollywood movie. When you start looking at these computer images and all of the fraud going on and all of the money that they're given, and then you hear even presidents talk about a new space force and all of us going to Mars. Now, you start wondering, how do you even know it exists? And as more and more little information comes forth regarding the distance between us and the moon, the actual distance between us and the sun, and all these different things that just don't make sense according to NASA, then you start really wondering, what are the biggest lies? And is it better to die thinking that, oh, well, I'm a conspiracy theorist and it can't be true and I'm just crazy? That's what they'll do to you. And the real point is, I think it's better to question all of these things, because when you start talking about these big lies that we're talking about, think about some of the other things that you have been told. What about chemtrails? Look up in the sky and see those white lines that go all over the sky, and then they'll tell you those are contrails from airplanes. Impossible. But people will believe it. I even talked to a pilot who believed it. Crazy, and worked for American Airlines. But anyway, we'll be back with some of the biggest lies ever told and some of the responses to those lies on the Investigative Journal.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app, for all of your mobile devices. Streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This isn't happening.
Okay, so we're back for the second half hour of the greatest show on earth. I say that because where else can you come and really enjoy being called a conspiracy theorist? And I really love it because, you know, all we're doing is questioning things that we're told. How many of us, I bet you everybody listening, believes that the earth is round and that there's satellites and we went to the moon and all those things, if you believe that, because you've been told that. I mean, do you have really proof? When's the last time you went to the moon? Okay? When's the last time you even went into space? But you're going to believe NASA? But it's interesting because remember we talked about Arthur Clarke? Well, it was convenient because it was Clarke's 2001 Space Odyssey. Remember that? It was made into a movie by Stanley Kubrick. And in 1968, and the Apollo 11 moon landings could have been faked. We've heard of that by Kubrick in the studios in 1969. One could surmise, and if you start looking at that video of what they showed us, how are you going to believe we went to the moon? One can surmise that the 2001 Space Odyssey was the dry run for Apollo, right? It also smacks of predictive programming with a little MK Ultra mixed in, doesn't it? The 2001 Space Odyssey was the primer for the Apollo hoax. Oh my goodness, how can we believe these things? Since we know from part one that the internet, look at that International Space Station. My God, that thing looks fake. If you think it looks real, fine. But you know, people will believe anything, right? If they're told enough, and if there's enough, if the lie's big, they'll believe it if they're told by their big bosses, right? People with money. Now, so let's say the International Space Station is a fake. Then you can say, are satellites really a fake? I don't see any pictures of them that make any sense. The only thing that exists could be the profit margins of NASA. Satellites could be pseudoscience, just like there's science regarding, what they tell us about the spinning globe. And there's no credible evidence that they exist. There's no actual photos, no actual video footage, only Photoshop, Pixar, SGI, CGI satellite images. The staunch evidence that satellites do not exist is simple. Just think about it. If there's no credible proof, then how do they exist? It's, for example, you go in a criminal trial, and somebody's put on trial for murder, and there's no credible proof that he did it or she did it, then there's no murder. So where is the credible proof outside of, testimony from witnesses that never can prove it? They don't have actual evidence. It's hearsay. It's not admissible, right? People say this. Yeah, but I saw the International Space Station. Now consider for a moment that what you saw was a replica of it. Now in World War II, the U.S. made wide use of inflatable tanks and rubber airplanes to deceive Hitler's reconnaissance efforts, right? That's true. We made fakes in World War II to make Hitler believe that they were real. So I'm saying if you really, they're still showing us a picture of the Earth that was done in 1978. Okay? And it's amazing that when you look at some of the moon landing pictures, they don't show any stars. And the reason is that if they did, they could be proven to be false. So anyway, and ask yourself, why haven't these astronauts really, the main astronaut, he gave one press conference in his whole career. Please, people say, well, I saw that space station. I saw that astronaut floating. Yeah, when you start really looking, you can really see a wire coming there where they're hanging from in some of these images when they make mistakes. How about the one when you really peruse this stuff? There's one where they actually start doing these things underwater, and you can see a scuba tank in the background. Now, remember William Cooper? He was a big conspiracy theorist. But you remember, a lot of these people, man, knew more than what you really give them credit for. But you know what? If you want to call him a conspiracy theorist, fine. But here's what he said. He said exploration of the moon stopped because it was impossible to continue the hoax without being discovered. And of course, they ran out of pre-filmed episodes. No man has ever ascended much higher than 300 miles, if that high above Earth's surface. At or under that altitude, the astronauts are beneath the radiation. Well, get into this radiation Van Allen belt and the shields and all this stuff. But then you're admitting that there's a space. I don't even know if you should go that far. But Cooper said no man has ever orbited, landed on, or walked upon the moon. I'll agree with him on that. And that's based on a lot of things that I've researched. I mean, I have to say that there's more evidence showing that we didn't go than we did. And the evidence that they show me isn't very credible. But, of course, everybody says we did. So you have to believe it, right? Right? Now, how many missions, really, to the moon could they fake? When it gets to be, when they do this Hollywood things, they do these new space movies. One was with Matt Damon, I remember. They have to be very careful because they look more real than what NASA shows you. But how many could they really fake? Just enough to set the table for the real goal. Perhaps thousands of fake satellites launched into space and big profits, right? This was a much safer and secure revenue stream, right? And so we look at all of these things. Let's look at some of the companies, though, and I'm taking this from an article I'm reading from a place called A Plain Truth. This particular section says, let's look at some of the companies involved in the satellite sector. Well, we have Musk now trying to get in, right? Talked about him. But we have Vanguard Group, State Street Corp, Fidelity, and BlackRock. Now, if you go to investorsmorningstar.com and put in the ticker symbol, look for the equity ownership institutions, and you'll see the same entities in control. And you'll see there are plenty of publicly held companies and bevy of privately held contractors whose majority stakeholders could possibly be involved together. Now, as it turns out, the Rothschilds are into venture capital game, for example. And Edmund Rothschild Investment Partners is involved. They can capitalize startups and have major equity stakes and then make a fortune off this stuff that doesn't even exist. What better way to make money? It is really amazing, isn't it? Well, let's get away from the financial sector, but let's ask ourselves a question. If there are no satellites, then how does GPS, global communications, and other supposed space-based platforms really work? Well, how about the first? We got Loran Tower Station, okay, and then we got one installed at the Royal Canadian Air Force. We're looking at two little examples. Now, the first is a land-based technology. Land-based communications have been around a long, long time and are still used today. Loran, remember that long-range navigation, was developed during World War II, with a range up to 1,500 miles. Towers like these were positioned to provide relatively seamless coverage for navigation. Towers positioned on islands would provide the necessary contact points for propagation at sea. The signal bounces off the ionosphere and creates a skywave, which in turn creates the skip distance to the next tower. Remember, this technology is about 70 years old, and incremental improvements in power, range, and efficiency have been made since. So we have things like, this is a simple, look. You can look into the capabilities of microwave transmissions, global GPS systems, all which are land-based, are based on cell tower triangulations. And Google basically will explain that. So basically, a lot of all of this is land-based. Now, why don't we use satellite communication instead? Because they can't carry terabytes of data for less than $1 billion per communication line. The bandwidth available using a single fiber optic cable and a laser beam is much greater than you can get from a single satellite radio channel. This is due to the high frequency and shorter wavelength of light compared to microwaves. The higher the frequency, the greater the bandwidth. So we have a lot of differing things. There's another way of propagating data. It's through undersea cables. And you can see that there are cables that connect all the continents with redundancy. There's an excellent place you can find if you just Google underwater high-speed cables. There's a website that explains how these cables are laid out and also lists the advantages of cables versus satellites. So there's a lot of little nails in the satellite coffins. Besides all these land-based technologies that exist and are used, the real pig in the poke, as said here in this little article I'm reading, that creates the illusion of satellites' ability are light than air vehicles, LAV, or high-altitude airships and high-altitude platforms. This updated concept of proven technology takes a lighter-than-air vehicle into a realm that gives users capabilities on par with satellites at a fraction of the cost. Lockheed Martin has built more than 8,000 lighter-than-air platforms, which is a pretty significant number for that fact alone. They also have a nifty brochure about them. Now, these lighter-than-air vehicles, they reach altitudes of about 70,000 feet. So anyway, we can get really into the weeds here technically, but the real question is, why do we believe they exist if there's no actual proof? And that's what really bugs me about this whole thing, because I would love to believe in them, believe in space, believe in all that they tell us. And I'd say, boy, we got some really smart people, but they don't give you really good evidence. And so we all have a tendency, because how many of us are ever going to get a really chance to see it, to really feel it, to understand it? We're going to have to take the word of somebody. But you know what? I want to go back and look at some of the people that have looked at this and said, no way can we be living on a round orbiting globe. Okay, here's somebody that brings some information and doesn't believe that we live on a globe Earth. Here we go.
Narrated by Eric Dubé. The Globe Earth Lie. Wolves in sheep's clothing have pulled the wool over our eyes. For almost 500 years, the masses have been thoroughly deceived by a cosmic fairy tale of astronomical proportions. We have been taught a falsehood so gigantic and diabolical that it has blinded us from our own experience and common sense, from seeing the world and the universe as they truly are. Through pseudoscience books and programs, mass media and public education, universities and government propaganda, the world has been systematically brainwashed, slowly indoctrinated over centuries into the unquestioning belief of the greatest lie of all time. David Wardlaw Scott said, "Children are taught in their geography books, when too young to apprehend aright the meaning of such things, that the world is a great globe revolving around the sun, and the story is repeated continuously year by year till they reach maturity, at which time they generally become so absorbed in other matters as to be indifferent as to whether the teaching be true or not, and, as they hear of nobody contradicting it, they presume that it must be the correct thing, if not to believe, at least to receive it as a fact. They thus tacitly give their assent to a theory which, if it had first been presented to them at what are called years of discretion, they would at once have rejected. The consequences of evil teaching, whether in religion or in science, are far more disastrous than is generally supposed, especially in a luxurious, laissez-faire age like our own. The intellect becomes weakened, and the conscience seared. For 500 years, an elite cabal of sun-worshippers has propagated this nihilistic, atheistic cosmology and cosmogony, unquestioningly believed by the vast majority of the world. We have been taught, contrary to all common sense and experience, that the seemingly motionless, flat earth beneath our feet is actually a massive, moving ball spinning through space at over 1,000 miles per hour, wobbling and tilted 23.5 degrees on its vertical axis, while orbiting the sun at a blinding 67,000 miles per hour, in concert with the entire solar system, spiraling 500,000 miles per hour around the Milky Way, and careening across the expanding universe away from the Big Bang at an incredible 670 million miles per hour, but that you can feel and experience none of it. We have been taught that a mysterious force called gravity, a magical magnetism responsible for keeping everything from falling or flying off the spinning ball Earth, is just strong enough to hold people, oceans, and the atmosphere tightly to the surface, but just weak enough to allow bugs, birds, and planes to take off with ease. David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "I remember being taught when a boy that the earth was a great ball revolving at a very rapid rate around the sun, and when I expressed to my teacher my fears that the waters of the oceans would tumble off, I was told that they were prevented from doing so by Newton's great law of gravitation, which kept everything in its proper place. I presume that my countenance must have shown some signs of incredulity, for my teacher immediately added, 'I can show you a direct proof of this. a man can whirl around his head a pail filled with water without its being spilt, and so, in like manner, can the oceans be carried round the sun without losing a drop. As this illustration was evidently intended to settle the matter, I then said no more upon the subject. Had such been proposed to me afterwards as a man, I would have answered somewhat as follows. Sir, I beg to say that the illustration you have given of a man whirling a pail of water round his head, and the oceans revolving round the sun, does not in any degree confirm your argument, because the water in the two cases is placed under entirely different circumstances, but, to be of any value, the conditions in each case must be the same, which here they are not. The pail is a hollow vessel, which holds the water inside it, whereas, according to your teaching, the earth is a ball, with a continuous curvature outside, which, in agreement with the laws of nature, could not retain any water. We have been taught that the ball earth spins at a constant velocity, perfectly dragging the atmosphere along so we cannot feel the slightest bit of motion, perturbation, wind, or air resistance. They say we cannot feel any of this motion because the magical velcro of gravity pulls the atmosphere precisely along, and we cannot measure any of this motion because the stars are so incredibly far away that over 100 million miles of supposed annual orbit around the sun amounts to not a single inch of relative parallax change. How convenient. We have been taught that the apparent orbit of the sun, planets, and stars, but not the moon, around the earth are all optical illusions, that it is, in fact, the earth beneath our feet which moves, and our eyes that deceive us. Special exception is made for the moon, however, which is said to revolve around the earth just as it appears. Since we only ever see one side of the moon, we have been taught this is because the moon's supposed 10.3 mile per hour west to east rotation, combined with its 2,288 mile per hour orbit of Earth, just happens to be the exact motion and speed necessary to perfectly cancel out the Earth's supposed 1,000 mile per hour east to west rotation and 67,000 mile per hour orbit of the Sun, thereby creating the perpetual dark side of the moon illusion. Oh, really? Though the Sun and Moon appear to be relatively small, equal-sized bodies revolving around a stationary Earth, we have been taught that this too is an optical illusion, and they are in fact thousands of miles divergent in diameter. They say the Sun is actually a whopping 865,374 miles across, 109 times wider than the Earth, and, contrary to all experience, experiments, and common sense, that we revolve around it. They say the Moon is 2,159 miles across, a quarter the size of the Earth, and why they appear the same size is because the Moon is only 238,000 miles away, while the Sun is an unfathomable 93 million miles away from the Earth. And these just happen to be the exact diameters and distances necessary for a viewer from Earth to falsely perceive them as being the same size. You don't say. Lactantius, in his On the False Wisdom of the Philosophers, wrote, "A sphere where people on the other side live with their feet above their heads, where rain, snow, and hail fall upwards, where trees and crops grow upside down, and the sky is lower than the ground. The ancient wonder of the hanging gardens of Babylon dwindle into nothing in comparison to the fields, seas, towns, and mountains that pagan philosophers believe to be hanging from the earth without support." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "I confess that I cannot imagine how any human being, in his proper senses, can believe that the sun is stationary when, with his own eyes, he sees it revolving around the heavens, nor how he can believe that the earth on which he stands is whirling with the speed of lightning around the sun when he feels not the slightest motion." We have been taught that those tiny pinpricks of light in the night sky known as planets or wandering stars are actually physical, globular, Earth-like habitations millions of miles away. We have even been shown supposed video footage of the one called Mars. We have been taught that the tiny pinpricks of light in the sky known as the fixed stars are actually distant suns trillions of miles away, each complete with their own solar systems, orbiting moons, and Earth-like planets which potentially harbor alien life. We have been taught that the moon has no light of its own, but is merely a reflector of the sun's light, that some masons from NASA actually walked on the moon, that some other masons from NASA sent rovers to Mars, that satellites and space stations are incessantly spinning in suspended animation above the Earth, that Hubble telescopes are taking snapshots of distant planets, galaxies, stars, quasars, black holes, wormholes, and other fantastic celestial phenomena.
Okay, let me cut in here. We've been taught a lot of things, haven't we? A lot of things that we've been taught perhaps aren't true. And I started the show by asking you, what do you think is the biggest lie you've ever been told? And I'm going to end it by saying, if you really look and you start checking them off, all the ones we mentioned throughout this show, 9/11, the Lincoln assassination, Kennedy, do you still believe in lone gunmen? I think if you really look, you'll spend some time thinking about all of the fantasies you've been told about the very earth you've lived on. And if you still believe it, then look for the evidence contrary to what you've been told. There's very little that makes a lot of sense when you really think about it. But anyway, we all fall into the same category. We believe what we're told. Back on the Investigative Journal, I'll be back Monday with more lies and leakers, as President Trump says.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.